A deep exploration of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Unspun World with John Simpson tonight at 11:15. But now on BBC Two, including PMQ's It's Politics Live with Alex Forsyth.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15, and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Rehman Chishti, Labour MP Emma Hardy, the Daily Mirror's political editor Pippa Creyer, and the Chief Executive of the Conservative home website Mark Wallace. Today, is the war in Ukraine driving a cost of living emergency? The 1970s gave us an energy crisis. Are we seeing something similar? And what, if anything, should the government do about it? 2 million people have fled the fighting, but there's anger here about the government's refugee response.
Get them processed and get them in. This is a disgrace. When the minister leaves this dispatch box, ask him to go back to the Home Office and tell them to get a grip.
It is the United Kingdom making the world's biggest contribution to the humanitarian aid.
An historic address by the Ukrainian president to the House of Commons. But should we be sending warplanes to Ukraine? And we'll be taking you back to the Commons live at midday for Prime Minister's questions. All that coming up. But I want to start today with a story that is in the Financial Times. We can take a look at this headline. It says, British drivers advised to limit speed to 55 miles per hour to battle against Putin. Now, this is a senior energy expert who is suggesting the public could reduce the speed they drive their cars, their temperatures at home, turn down their thermostats to cut dependence on Russian fuel. Rehman, do you think he's right?
Well, I think what we have to look at, if the United Kingdom, which is what we're doing, is leading the way internationally to challenge Putin's aggression in Ukraine and stand up for an international rules-based system and for democracy around the world, then on that basis, there are going to be ramifications, back at home here in the United Kingdom. And I think what we saw with President Zelenskyy yesterday, he said, with regards to the United Kingdom, he wants the United Kingdom to stand with fellow civilizations around the world. And if we are going to do that, we all around the world have to push back and find alternatives with regards to our energy supply, rather than being reliant on Russia. For example, in the UK, we have 4% of the Russian gas and 8% of, 4% of gas and 8% oil. So therefore, we have to look at all options with regards to renewables and also our own personal behaviour.
And does that mean maybe driving a bit slower, turning down the thermostat?
Well, look, I think we all have to. We all have individual responsibility. And I'm not going to sit here today to say individuals should do X, Y or Z. But the point on that, I think in 1974, when we also had challenges with regards to energy supply, I think that was one measure that was looked at in 1974. But I would say at this point, we all have to look at different avenues that we can look at to ensure that we do everything we can to move away from that Russian dependency on oil and gas and energy sector.
Emma, do you think individuals should be doing their bit to battle Putin?
Well, I think on the point around energy costs, I think we have to remember that the standing charges are going up. I mean, I'm being contacted by constituents who are telling me that, I'm forced to choose between heating and eating. But actually, when I can't put my heating on, and even if I don't put my heating on, my standing charges are increasing all the time, which is why I think, we're going to obviously talk about the cost of living in more general. I think on the limiting lorries to 55 miles an hour, I have to say, I've talked to the HGV vehicle industry quite a lot. I think if they are going to look at doing that, then we need to looking at drivers' terms and conditions, which are appalling.
What about individuals just driving more slowly?
I think it has to be, it frustrates me that this is always put down to the individual's responsibility. The government have a responsibility here on the cost of living crisis. The government have a responsibility to make our country less energy reliant on Russia. The government had a responsibility when they scrapped the Green Homes Energy Grants, which have made insulate our homes and make them a lot warmer. The fact that they've not allowed onshore wind turbines, the fact that they've been so slow to move to green renewable energy. These are all government's responsibility. And I think pushing it onto the individuals, saying turn your thermostat down and drive slower, is simply not fair.
Hippo, might it be that people want to do their bit?
Well, they may well do, but I think what this does is personalise it for them. And for a long time, we've had lots of great rhetoric from the government about how the country is going to stand in support of Ukraine. Rightly, there's very much a moral case for that, but very little on them on what the actual ramifications are going to be for people at home. There's already a cost of living crisis as we go into this spring, before we even get to the impact of the Ukraine crisis on energy prices. And I think what the government has probably not spelt out yet is just how dramatically this is going to impact on people. Energy bills are already set to go up by about £2,000, or to about £2,000 on average in April. We could see them push beyond £3,000 in the spring. At the same time, costs are rising across the board because of inflation. We've got tax rises and an effective freeze on universal credit coming in at the start of April. So people are already feeling the pressure. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are rightly saying that people in Ukraine are experiencing much more immediate pain than we will at home. But it's inevitable. You know, they're our government, and people will want to hear from them what they're going to do, possibly the Chancellor in the budget later this month, to directly help them with these cost of living pressures that are coming as a result of all of this.
I mean, Mark, Pippa's making the point there might be a limit to what individuals can do, but would you maybe be prepared to drive at 55 miles an hour if it meant helping?
Personally, I don't drive, but in but
well, then no.
but I think firstly, good luck. I think getting people to drive at 55 miles an hour. We were talking about this before we came on air, and I think a lot of people probably won't do it in practice. But frankly, whether people choose to do some things for the purposes of seeing it as a struggle against Putin, or whether price ends up having that effect, whether people like it or not. The fact is, I was in a taxi on the way here from the station, and the guy said, well, it now costs so much to fill up my taxi. I don't drive around town looking for jobs anymore. I go and sit in a taxi rank and turn my engine off.
So it's changing his behaviour.
So it does change behaviour. Frankly, this is painful, but it's also what I'd refer to as NATO problems. We are very, very fortunate in this country that we are not in the position of Ukraine. Ukrainians are sheltering with their families in cellars under bombardment day and night at the moment. They are paying in blood for the chance of their freedom and the future of their country. We have these knock-on effects. We have to try and deal with them and lighten that load, but we're also extremely lucky that we're not in their shoes.
And let's not forget that. But while we're talking about possible knock-on effects for people in this country, let's just take a look at this headline in The Sun. It says, high-priced Ukraine war set to cost British households an extra £1,259 each this year. Now, this is based on analysis from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and this is due, it says, to the rising cost of oil and gas as well as food as a result of this conflict. So, Rehman, is it not right that actually what individuals can do to mitigate this kind of increase is really limited?
Well, look, I think what we have to look at, again, I think being completely frank with the British public, if we aren't going to stand up for the international rules-based system, if we aren't going to stand up for democracy, looking at that statement yesterday by President Zelenskyy saying, look, Britain is a great nation, a resilient nation, you've gone through those challenges before, we need your support at this difficult hour. If that is the case, and we are prepared to set up to the table to do that and lead the international coalition, whether it's to the International Criminal Court or whether it's to sanctions, there is a knock-on effect back here in the United Kingdom. And with that, what the government has done, is put aside $20 billion with regards to supporting individuals with the cost of living, whether that's with regards to capping fuel prices for the 12 years in a row, whether that's looking at alternative renewable energies. So since 2010, you've seen 500% increase in renewable sector, whether that's now in further pushing that on hydro, whether it's nuclear energy, whether that's more drilling on in the North Sea oil. So United Kingdom, I think from a government perspective, we have put forward proposals for up to $20 billion to support individuals with the cost of living in these difficult, challenging times.
A lot of that was before the war in Ukraine, which we're now expecting to have an added impact. We've got the spring statement due from the Chancellor in a couple of weeks. Do you think that he might have to do something more? Does he need to intervene perhaps in a way that he did at the start of the COVID pandemic, where you recognise the scale of this challenge?
I think what you have to look at is where are we at the moment as the United Kingdom in terms of our economy. So for us, when we came into government, we had some of the worst budget deficits our country's ever experienced from a legacy from Labour.
No. You can't blame the Labour government for the cost of living
but I tell you what we can say.
Had over
but
10 years,
let me say the point I was saying is when we came into government, we inherited a very large budget deficit.
Decade, and
if you let me finish. Then I'm very happy to come back. But the point I'm making on that, the point I'm making, if I may finish, that's the difference between what's going on around the world and over here is about democracy. Hearing me out, and I'll hear you out on that. The point I was making on that is, having come into government in 2010, and I accept we've been in government 12 years, and employment has gone up by 3 million. We've dealt with that. The issue is, have we taken steps in the last 12 years to make sure that our economy now, which in the G7 is the fastest growing economy compared to all other economies, are we now in a position, having taken those decisions, to be in a position to now deal with these challenges, whether it was 400 billion on COVID, on furlough, supporting people in these difficult times? We have managed the economy in the right, proper way to ensure that we can now put in place measures through economic means to support individuals now.
Emma.
Oh, with respect, and I do respect you. You know, it's somebody who I know resigned from government on point of principle, and I always respect that. But with respect, you talk about the fastest growing economy, that's because it fell the furthest. You know, I mean, this is nonsense figures, and we can all manipulate statistics to make the point that we want to make. The point is that why should the tragedy that's happening in Ukraine, and I completely take on board the fact that we are, you know, very grateful that we're not in the same situation of those people, but why should that fall on the people who have the least? And that's the point here, that the cost of living crisis is impacting the people who already had the least, and that's simply not fair. And it goes back to when we look at national insurance contributions and we look at how that taxation system works. In national insurance contributions, we just look at that individually. We have a system where more tax is going to be taken from a care worker than a landlord who might own 27 different homes. I mean, this isn't a fair or progressive way to look at how we're going to fund these things. And when I was on the Treasury Select Committee just this week and we're listening to economists talk about this, I think that figure could actually be quite conservative. It could even be greater than that when we look at the cost of living impact on the very poorest. But I think the point where the government need to think about taking action here is, for a long time now, it has been the very poorest that have faced that heating or eating appalling dilemma. What we're going to start to see now is lots of people on lower incomes going up into the middle classes facing that same impossible dilemma. And the government must act when it comes in on the spring statement. They need to take this.
Okay, can I just say this directly before Ben on that? It's with regards to supporting those on the lowest income. Absolutely, the government, you know, has to do everything they possibly can, taking the lowest earners out of taxation, you know, which is what we did by increasing that threshold by 90%. With regards to the national insurance contributions, those who are highest earners will be paying more of that contribution. The top 1% will be paying 27%. So it's making sure doing it in a broader, fairer, and progressive way.
My point about the landlords it still stands.
Okay,
they pay no more.
We're talking about whether the government, the Conservatives having been in power for 12 years is long enough to have dealt with some of these issues. Part of the troubling thing about this is, frankly, governments of both parties over the last 40 years have failed to really make big strategic decisions on things like energy supply. Where has been the frankness from the Blair government, from the Brown government, the coalition, Theresa May, even the current government, about the fact that when people talk a big game on, for example, net zero, when are people talking, or the Climate Change Act under Labour, when are people talking to consumers about what the actual cost in their pocket of this is? It does trouble me that we have a relatively short-termist political decision-making about not doing shale gas, or not properly developing nuclear, or not coming clean with people about, we're going to hit a target in 2050, when, frankly, with all due respect, most of us will probably not be back on Politics Live taking accountability. If the BBC would like to book me in, my diary's open. But, you know, there's a lack of accountability there, I think, over the course of decades about really big questions that are fundamental to the cost of living or industrial competitiveness.
Pippa, I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether you think the Chancellor is going to have to do something more, perhaps in the shorter term, around NI, around VAT on fuel. Do you think he's going to have to move?
I think almost certainly. I mean, bear in mind that we're on the brink of another recession with all of this. I mean, that's the sort of very worrying backdrop domestically, economically to all of this. They've got the cost of living squeeze. There's another recession on the horizon, and the Chancellor, who is in a position where he was starting to be able to think about balancing the books, is now going to have to probably rip up the budget plans and start again, because there may well have to be support may have to be something on VAT cuts, maybe cuts on fuel duty, more targeted support to the less well off when it comes to dealing with those price hikes and bill hikes. And I think he will be extremely worried, having emerged from the pandemic and got the economy back to a position that he feels is able to sort of make those long-term strategic decisions, which governments do need to make. He's going to have to focus on the here and the now and supporting people in the immediate future.
Well, we have mentioned the longer-term aspect of this, and a lot of that is focused on fuel and energy, and we're expecting more from the government perhaps in the next week about its plans for this. But for now, just take a look at this story in the BBC. It says, war in Ukraine, West hits Russia with oil bans and gas curbs. This is the US, the UK and the EU, all of whom are talking about either banning or reducing oil and gas imports from Russia. We're expecting a little bit more from the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, in the House of Commons on this later today. But, Rehman, is there a danger that the fact the UK government's decided to phase this out over a period of time actually gives Putin and his regime time to respond?
Well, I think that realistically, if you're looking at the issue about the challenges we're going to face back in the UK with the energy prices, therefore, is the United Kingdom in a position at this point in time, take into account Ben's point, the strategic decisions successive governments look, Lib Dem, Coalition, Conservatives, Labour, have we taken over the years the strategic decisions, on extra production and North Sea oil, nuclear? The fact is we haven't, across the board. When Russia and China, they're looking at 20 years ahead. They're in a different position from an authoritarian government. They stay in for 20 years. We go through election cycles. And therefore, the challenge that we have now is with regards to either we say, we're going to do this now. OK, we've said we're not going to do it, but we've got to do it in a strategic way so that whilst we phase it out, we can increase our renewable sector, which, as I say, from 2010 has gone up by 500%, whether it's with further drilling in North Sea oil, whether it's more nuclear, whether it's hydrogen energy, whether it's offshore wind. And I think, therefore, it's going to take time. But we're not in competition with Europe or with the United States. We all have to come together because Putin is pushing on two fronts, a violent war against the Ukrainian people and an economic war against the West. And we then need to be in a coordinated way, take practical, realistic steps. And I think that's why a coordinated, phased-out approach is the right way forward.
Emma, Labour broadly supports this idea of reducing dependency on Russian imports. But it's not without risk, is it? A risk that actually it just pushes prices up higher, that might help Putin's coffers in the short term, that we might end up with some sort of stagflation, so continued high inflation, a slow economy. There are dangers to this.
There are dangers, and stagflation is genuinely a danger. And there's as many points actually there I did support. I support the idea of a gradual removal. You couldn't just switch the tap off tomorrow. It would hit people's pockets. It would hit the cost of living immediately overnight. And we do need to look at investing more in renewables and onshore wind. And it is frustrating, as much as I agree with some points, I have to push back on the fact that the Conservative government actually stopped the onshore wind. Onshore wind is something that we have the production capability for. It's cleaner, it's modern, it's a far better alternative than looking at fracking. It's something we could do tomorrow. And in fact, Labour's council in Hull are looking at creating their own council-owned onshore wind energy production to look at providing some of the energy for the people who live in that local area. The government could look at supporting other councils around the country as well to look at becoming and developing that self-sufficiency. That's, to use the Prime Minister's phrase, oven ready. It's there, it can go. What I wouldn't want to see is us going down the sort of dirty alternative of fracking as a short-term solution to what is a longer-term problem. But we have to help people over this difficulty and over this pain, and that goes back to the point we were just making about the supporting with the cost of living.
Rehman, just briefly, some of your colleagues want to see fracking, that debate revisited. Robert Jenrick, the former Community Secretary, among them. What do you think?
Well, I think there's clearly a difference of opinion. I've got to be realistic. What comes to me first is the safety of communities, and we've seen the challenge that we've heard before from the evidence-led approach. We're not Houston, the United States, with our geographical space and what they can produce, and the community spread out. We are in a population where we are, on the size and our geography. I think that there's real concerns with regards to fracking and the impact on the environment. But of course, those who are pushing on it, let them put forward the proposals. We'll look at them. But I do have concerns with the way it's been put so far.
Mark, do you think fracking's back on the table?
Yes, I think rightly so. I mean, you're absolutely right. We're not Houston, USA, and the UK will always rightly have its own, I would argue, stronger environmental protections. My understanding is we also have different. I'm not a geologist. My understanding is the geological picture is different in improved stability and security terms compared to the US. I'd refer you 10 years ago. I was launching a report for the Institute of Directors looking at the potential economic benefits of shale gas. Certainly cleaner than coal. And the fact is, if you're talking about a transition, you're talking about a transition away from the dirtier, more polluting sources, more affordable, wider knock-on benefits. Crucially, we need baseload capacity. If you want to have solar, you want to have wind, while battery technology improves, you need to have baseload. Some of that will be nuclear. That takes time.
Cross-party supported, actually.
Certainly, but it's also cross-party not decided on, which is which is the kind of practical problem. So I do think there are benefits. The IOD also, had experts in the field look at questions about earthquakes and so on, and I think a lot of that's overblown.
I have a huge amount of admiration and respect for Ben, and I think on...
I'm Mark. Ben's much more successful.
No, sorry, Mark. Sorry. But with regards to the issue on the where we are, the first presumption for me is the community safety and the impact that we have on tremors. with regards to how it affects the individuals across the country. But of course, as I said, those who want to advocate it, let them put it on the table.
OK, Pippa.
We'll have a look at it.
Well, we've got the government's energy strategy coming up, but we were told it was going to be this week, and now it seems to be a couple of weeks, so we'll see it at some point soon. And we'll hear, I think, a lot more arguments as to what sources of energy can be looked at. I mean, I think the reality is that whether you're looking at fracking or whether you're looking at putting more money into nuclear, or getting agreement on nuclear and getting more money into renewables, none of those provide an immediate solution to the energy crisis. And so I think what we'll see happening is that the existing drilling that's going on in the North Sea for oil and gas will continue, and we will probably see more drilling licences granted there in the short term as part of a transition. And I think there's general sort of consensus that is how it's going to happen. But at the same time as dealing with the immediate issues, the government does have to, frankly, get its act together when it comes to deciding what the future of this is going to be. As we've seen increasingly at various points over the last few years, and now at sort of really sort of point of urgency, we need to have a sustainable energy supply, security of energy supply that isn't necessarily reliant on more volatile parts of the world.
OK, as you say, Pippa, we're expecting that energy strategy in the next couple of weeks, and we will, of course, be right across the detail. But for now, I want to take you back to yesterday for what was an historic moment in the Commons when President Zelenskyy addressed the House of Commons, the first time in this format. Let's just take a little look at what he had to say.
Please increase the pressure of sanctions against this country, and please recognize this country as a terrorist state. And please make sure that our Ukrainian skies are safe. Please make sure that you do what needs to be done and what is stipulated by the greatness of your country.
President Zelenskyy addressing the Commons yesterday. Emma, were you there? It was quite a moment.
I was there. It was quite an emotional moment, if I'm being honest with you. It still feels quite surreal in a way that we have war in Europe, and we're seeing images that we grew up seeing in history books. You know, people sheltering in the underground, people being torn away from their families, kissing their children goodbye on railway stations. This was our history lessons, and now it's our reality now. And I don't think anyone could listen to that and fail to be incredibly moved and want to help and want to do the right thing. And obviously, the big question is what is that and what does that look like? But yes, I was there. It was a powerful moment of unity in the Commons, and I'd like to say unity across the country for the suffering we're seeing there.
I mean, it was the second time we saw this round of applause across the Commons chamber. Were you there?
I was there. And I think seeing Parliament come together and the message that we had from President Zelenskyy, who I have to say, looking at how he's dealing with the situation, is an inspiration to all of us. Yeah. And I think the heartfelt emotion, looking at the tragedy, and went through day by day. This is what happened on day one, day two, and looking at what's happening in Ukraine. It's something which ties into our own British history, as he said, in terms of what happened in the Second World War. You fight for your survival. Your backs are against the wall. You know, we need you to stand with us at this difficult, challenging hour. And I think either we do now or we give in to the dictatorship of what Putin's doing. And where he said, either we need your support as a fellow civilized state, I think it's, and he quoted Shakespeare, with regards to whether you do it now or you don't do it. So I think looking at that and then saying, need your support, and I think militarily, economically, diplomatically, the United Kingdom, as he said, is doing everything we can to support Ukraine. Because for me, look, do you know what? Above everything in the world, either you have your freedom or you don't have your freedom. An attack on one freedom is an attack on all freedoms, and we have to support them at these difficult times.
You mentioned there the actions of NATO and the West in this, and President Zelenskyy repeated that call that he wanted a no-fly zone, which the NATO has ruled out for reasons that it doesn't want to come into conflict with Russia. But I just want to show you this front page of the Times. It says, Ukraine to get NATO jets. Now, this was a proposal that was made by Poland to deliver their MiG-29 jets to an American airbase in Germany so that they could then be used by Ukraine. The front pages went to press last night, and then when we woke up this morning, the US had effectively kiboshed this idea. Pippa, are we seeing a fracturing of the unity that we've seen so far among the Western allies?
I wouldn't say that it's a fracturing. I think they all share a great desire to do more, and that includes supporting Ukraine where they can militarily. But there has to be a degree of realism. And there is a realism amongst Western leaders that anything which could be interpreted by Russia as an aggressive act from NATO suddenly widens the conflicts out beyond the borders of Ukraine. Awful though that conflict is, it would be so much worse if it spread right across Europe, particularly with the unpredictability of somebody like Vladimir Putin in office and the powers and weapons that he has at his disposal. So I think it's an unfortunate reality that by basing NATO, effectively NATO jets on an effectively NATO base in Europe and using them to fly sorties over Ukraine to protect its airspace, to protect its civilians on the ground, would be regarded as an aggressive act, and the West has to avoid that.
Mark?
But as I understand it, one of the things that both Poland and Ukraine have been looking at is the question of not using a NATO base to refuel and arm these jets to repeatedly fly sorties. The question is how to get them into and to Ukraine. You've got to ask, what is the material difference? I was watching a video this morning of a Ukrainian soldier somewhere in the east of Ukraine standing in front of a destroyed Russian tank saying, "We did this thanks to the gifts from Her Majesty the Queen." And what is the difference materially, politically, diplomatically between sending NLAWs from a factory in Belfast on British planes to Eastern Europe on trucks to Ukrainian soldiers to kill Russians and to destroy Russian tanks than Poland providing empty old warplanes to Ukrainian pilots to fly? I think this is very disappointing to see the Pentagon go wobbly. And you've got to say, there have been a lot of Zelenskyy-Churchill comparisons for obvious reasons. What that speech yesterday reminded me of was Churchill in the Canadian Parliament, when he was still trying to persuade America to back us, to help us to survive. And they said Hitler would wring our neck like a chicken, some neck. He's begging for that help, and I think the Pentagon should not be wobbling at this point.
Rehman, that's a good point. What is the difference between what we've supplied and what's being proposed by Poland?
The fact is, it's sanctions, you know, for me, is the right way forward. If you're looking at a militarily perspective, it's, and Mark, on your point, you say, you know, what is the difference? The fact is, it's if you have NATO planes and they want a no-fly zone, if it's NATO planes going from either what people say from a NATO base or up in the air, if they're up in the air in the Ukrainian skies and they've got to take out a Russian tank, then suddenly what you don't want to do is escalate this into what we all don't want to do, a third world war. And I think Putin is trying to draw us into that.
This isn't about the no-fly zone. I completely agree. A no-fly zone would involve striking Russian targets, probably in Russia.
But what I'm saying is that if anything gradually creeps into that escalation, then I think this is what Putin may want us to get into. And I think, therefore, to cripple, you know, Russian economy through the sanctions that we've all internationally come together and applied, and especially through SWIFT and the central bank, is, in my view, the right way to do it. Any, you know, suggestion or action which could lead into that military escalation where NATO is drawn in, I think risk the world coming into that third world war concept. And I would not want that, and I don't think anybody would want us to get into that.
Of course not, but part of the difficulty here is people say, well, Vladimir Putin said this would be a provocation and so on. The fact is that Vladimir Putin said lots of things would be a provocation. Russia said letting the Baltics and Poland into NATO would be a provocation. Thank goodness we did it, or they'd be rolling through Lithuania on a mission to protect Kaliningrad right now. They said that allowing Ukraine to apply for NATO or allowing it to have its own democracy would be a provocation. Frankly, too often we've listened to the threats of Vladimir Putin, and that appeasement led us to the point of him being emboldened at this stage.
Emma, would you like to see the West doing more militarily?
I agree with Rehman. I mean, this isn't a game. You know, people sometimes, when you see people commenting on Twitter, it's like it's some kind of computer game and it's not real life. This is real life. These are real decisions. And there's a genuine concern here that this could escalate in the way that Pippa and Rehman have outlined. I mean, that should not be dismissed or taken lightly. We can do more when it comes to sanctions. We should do more in terms of sending military. And I get Mark's point around, you know, they had the picture of the soldier who had taken it down and said, with thanks to the UK government. So yes, we can send more military support. Yes, we can send more sanctions, humanitarian support, and you know, and we'll get started on refugees, I'm sure, in a moment. Those all things need to be ramped up, but we cannot take decisions lightly. This is not a game. This is about real life. This is about real prospect of escalating war in Europe. We need to take this seriously, and each step we make needs to be carefully considered and should not be rushed in or pushed into making decisions that are rash.
On that we agree. I think the important thing is that in Westminster, but also among a lot of different Western capitals, where this wasn't always the case, people are now agreed that the much more advanced level of action, like sending anti-tank weapons and so on, you've seen welcome movement from Germany and others on this. The fact is we're now talking about one other step or not. And it's important and positive that, frankly, we're in that debate about exactly where that line is, rather than precisely rather than the position where Berlin was sending some old helmets. It's an improvement.
Emma, you did mention it there, but another aspect of the UK government's response to this is refugees, and there was a pretty stormy session in the House of Commons yesterday where Conservative MPs were among those who criticised the Home Office's slow response, in their words, so far. Now, we understand that there is being another support centre opened up in Lille in France to help those who are applying for visas to come to the UK, and we can speak to our correspondent Phil Mackey, who is in Lille for us now. Phil, what are you seeing there on the ground?
Not much, to be honest, Alex. There's no sign of this pop-up centre yet. It was talked about yesterday. There was a suggestion it would be open within 24 hours. This morning that had turned into a possibility of it being opened. We've spoken to the Mayor of Lille's office. They said the first they heard about it was when they read it in the English press. Whether it would be open today, they knew nothing about that either. Neither do the officials in Calais. The suggestion was that this would be a good place to have it. It's not as far as Paris or Brussels, to which people who need to get the right documentation and visas have to travel at the moment. So if you're in Calais, it's just over an hour to get here, and you can get here and back quite quickly. They would lay on free buses. But there's nothing happening at the moment, and nobody seems to know exactly what was going on. I was talking to a 26-year-old woman who's staying in the youth hostel in Calais this morning. She's travelled from Western Ukraine via Romania with her mother and her younger brother. Her dad lives in Reading, so they thought they would be OK to cross. They're stuck there. They've been there a few days now. They had to go to Paris yesterday to give their fingerprints, to go through all the documentation. They're back in the youth hostel. They say they're going to have to wait at least another 5 days. What they're saying is that it's a really confusing picture. It's very... they're hearing one thing from one person, another from another. They're getting different information via the media. Nobody really knows quite what's going on, and it's very slow and confusing as well. We're not talking about thousands of people, Alex. There are hundreds rather than thousands at the moment in France, and obviously many more refugees in other Eastern European countries may get processed there. But it's not looking great, and certainly here on the ground in Lille, they know no more than we do, and there doesn't seem to be any sign of this visa processing centre happening anywhere soon.
Phil, are there any British officials there on the ground at the moment?
Well, interestingly, so as I said, there are a lot of people, Ukrainians staying in Calais at the moment, because that's initially where they went to, thinking they could make the crossing either by ferry or via the tunnel. And there must be 30 or 40 in this particular place. And I asked whether or not any British officials had been to see them, and nobody had seen anybody. There was a British official at the ferry directing them to the hostel, but nobody had come to talk to them there. There doesn't appear to be anything going on the ground. It could be. We just don't know what's happening at the moment. There is a British presence in Lille. Obviously, the Channel Tunnel comes in here. It's a major connecting point across the city. And there's a British consulate here and whatever. But we don't know what this visa application centre would look like, how many people it could process. There are all kinds of rumours going around. I won't kind of bore you with them, because actually they just could be rubbish. It's Chinese whispers really on the ground at the moment, Alex, and until we get a clear idea, I can't tell you whether or not any of those Ukrainians are going to come here and be processed, or, as has happened so far, they're going from Calais to Paris or to Brussels for a day, and then back to the youth hostel to wait it out and wait to hear whether or not their visa has been granted.
OK, Phil Mackey in Lille, thank you very much for being with us. Rehman, it does sound like a bit of a shambles, doesn't it?
Well, I think what we have to look at in the context of it is we're into day 13 of the conflict in Ukraine. The United Kingdom's always made it clear that there is a four-pronged approach: humanitarian, military, economic and diplomatic. From us, at this point in time, working with the Ukrainian government to see what support they need. 400 million is being given to Ukraine. A key part of that is the humanitarian assistance. And I think at this point in time, what we're seeing, Calais is one option, but the largest number of individuals wanting to leave Ukraine is coming through via Poland. And I think the United Kingdom, with its strategic centres, has put extra focus on supporting refugees in those areas. I think it's around 750 now that are being given visas. 10,000 applications are going on. But I think what they are doing, it's in terms of the surge in the number of individuals across the European continent.
Months to wait for
but what I would say on that is, could we do more? Yes. yes. Are we going to do more? Absolutely. We're into a day 13 situation in Ukraine. And I think with the amount of support we've given, more than any other country bilaterally to Ukraine, covers humanitarian support. But of course, on this, we have done a lot, but of course, we need to do more.
Emma, Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, was this morning saying there's going to be a real ramping up of the number of appointments that are going to be made available. There are staff being sent to the areas, the countries around Ukraine, as well as those support centres opening up in France. Are you satisfied?
It's another catchphrase, isn't it? I mean, we've heard at pace, and now is it ramping up? Well, both of them are just catchphrases, and neither of them deliver on anything other than some rhetoric and lines in a newspaper. What does it mean? What does it mean when you have people waiting months for an appointment in Poland? What does it mean if you're a family desperate to flee the situation you're facing in the way that we've described it, the absolutely tragedy that they're facing there, and they can't come through to our country? It's an absolute farce. And I have to say, as an MP who deals with the Home Office repeatedly and has done since I've been elected, this isn't the first time the Home Office has found to be fairly incompetent when it comes to dealing with refugees and dealing with asylum and issues of that nature. Talk to any member of Parliament and they'll tell you the same thing. So the government cannot just blame the fact that they've been incompetent and unable to deal with this situation because of the crisis in the Ukraine. The Home Office has been failing for a long time. And while we're at it, sorry, but it does make me very cross, while we're at it, let's look at the Nationality and Borders Bill that's going through Parliament right now and what impact that will have on the number of refugees that are allowed into this country. We have a system here that is designed to make it as difficult as possible for refugees to flee the country they're from. And I believe that is by design, not just by incompetence.
I think the question is, it's in terms of what have we done in practice rather than rhetoric. I think since 2015, the United Kingdom has welcomed over 25,000 vulnerable individuals. With regards to the situation now in Ukraine, on the figures, the capacity to deal with that number of applications initially was about 900 per week. With the surge in resources being targeted to different centres, is up to 6,000 cases can now be dealt with per week in that. So I think on that basis, I think answering 2 points. One, to say whenever we do some is not enough. So 25,000 vulnerable people taken in by the United Kingdom since 2015, and with regards to the capacity to deal with that is from...
You must know that from your casework it's not been working for years.
Let me come back. With regards to the number of cases to be could be dealt with, the surge in number of personnel is from 900 to 6,000, of course. I used to sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee to hold the government to account. Of course, I see where there are challenges, but also I do think it's important to give credit where we are doing some good work in these difficult, challenging times. We've done a lot, we have to do more, and we will do more.
Yeah, but what about this point that Emma's suggesting that it's somehow driven by ideology rather than just the practicalities of the situation? What do you think?
Well, I think it certainly is. There's certainly a problem with Home Office bureaucracy, and we've seen that over many years. And there is a particular drive at the moment, and it is part of the whole UK being able to take responsibility for its own migration laws post-Brexit, to have more say, lots more say from British Parliament and British people into who we allow to come here. We saw a very generous offer to, for example, people from Hong Kong being resettled in the UK. We've seen an Afghan system which has got all sorts of problems going on with it. That's one for another day, probably. And we're now seeing this situation where the government seems to have been pushed incrementally towards a position. Initially, they said it would just be immediate family. They extended that to broader family. They extended that from 1 year to 3 years. And now we're in a position where they're saying that they will ramp up the numbers not only of offices but of appointments in Europe. But it's not happening yet. And it seems astonishing that 20,000 people have applied. Only 700 people, almost 2 weeks into this conflict, have been granted permission to come to their families. We haven't even heard any detail about the second route, the sponsorship route. And I'm interested in you saying that you're going to do more. Do you think, will we actually hear more from the government on different routes to let vulnerable people in here? Should they want to come? Lots of people want to stay in the region so they can go home, but should they want to come here? Because I think the public appetite, the public support for this is huge, and the government seems to be underestimating that.
Rehman, just come back on that point. I'll bring Mark in.
Yeah, people look, of course. I think should we look at all options? At the moment, we've got two routes. One with regards to the family and extended family, and then the other ones with regards to getting volunteers and communities to step up. Those are the two designated routes. But look, at this point in time, if we're going to stand up and say we're going to do everything we can to support the Ukrainian people, whether it's through military, diplomatic and economic help, of course we have to look at all options. And if there are other options, I would urge the government to look at every possible option to do everything we possibly can to help these people in Ukraine who are suffering immensely at this difficult, challenging time.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, Raymond's right and Raymond's wrong. He's absolutely right that we are helping in Ukraine and that the UK is helping in the region. That humanitarian aid does matter. You talk to representatives of Ukraine and and Poland, and they say that it does matter. It does make a difference. But, as Pippa says, we keep coming back to this issue where people think, is the Home Office deliberately obstructive or is it kind of incompetent? The depressing answer is that for many, many years it's been a mixture of both. I've dealt with a case of somebody entitled to British citizenship where the Home Office had tried to engage lawyers to reinterpret its own advice because it failed to know what its own law was, and I had to argue otherwise. I don't believe there's any mass opposition in this country to letting people who are in desperate need from Ukraine come here. Freedom-loving people who desperately want to get back to their own country as a democracy and a safe place as soon as possible. We should be a very, very hostile environment to Putinists in this country and a very safe refuge for people in Ukraine who need to be here. And that needs much swifter action. Just let them in.
Yes. I mean, Emma, on that point, Labour isn't advocating that all visas are waived entirely, that there should be no checks, is it? So where would you try and simplify or speed up this system?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about very quick, simple security checks before people are allowed to come in, but a much faster process. But I think we need to, after this initial crisis has been dealt with, we do need to look at the way the Home Office operates and the number of poor decisions made by the Home Office in general, because we've been raising these issues. The Home Affairs Select Committee have been raising these issues, individual parliamentarians have been raising these issues for years. Nothing seems to be happening. And I was sat in for the urgent question yesterday with Yvette and Priti Patel up at the dispatch box, and it seems that the government...
It wasn't Priti Patel yesterday, it was Kevin Foster, Home Office Minister.
Well, it was when Priti Patel was in, that might have been the day before, then I apologise. But it was when Priti Patel and Yvette Cooper were up at the dispatch box, and they were talking about this, and it seemed, I was sat there listening thinking, I don't really think the Home Secretary knows what's going on in her own department, because she was arguing back around the point around 50 personnel, despite the fact that a spokesperson from the Home Office has said, it's only been 50 people that have been allowed through. And I think, well, that comes back to this point of incompetence. Either the Home Secretary genuinely isn't aware of what's going on and therefore doesn't have a grip on what's happening and is incompetent, or she's not being entirely honest with the British people about what actually the situation is. But either way, we have a huge, area of government here, the Home Office, that we desperately need to work effectively to help all those people fleeing, all those people in need. And it's not working. It is failing us all at the moment.
Rehman, Emma's suggesting that this is a question of competence on the part of the ministers in the Home Office.
I think what we're looking at the moment, we're dealing with a unique set of challenging circumstances. Could I say to Emma, could we have predicted Ukraine 3 months ago? The answer is no. The question is, realistically, with everything going on, but could we realistically have foreseen the different challenges coming and the issue of individuals coming within the UK? The fact is, Emma, if we were, I didn't see Keir Starmer say that at the dispatch box, that he was focusing on other issues. The fact is, we're now
looking at the build-up of Russian personnel around the border. If you want to say 12 months ago, I'll go with it. But a few months ago, we were aware that Russia were building up their military forces.
I would love to go and see those transcripts where Keir Starmer 3 months ago in Parliament was talking about Ukraine and the issue of refugees and Labour's proposals.
We were debating the Nationality and Borders Bill and the policy on refugees.
We are in a situation, these are difficult, challenging times. What I would say is, let's look at what we can do in the future rather than what could have happened, previously. But at this point in time, I agree with Pippa. Looking at those two specific routes and looking at all other options to do everything we possibly can with what Mark was saying, we are a great country, which is a country which supports individuals who are being persecuted around the world, which is what I used to do in government as the Special Envoy for Religious Freedom, who are being persecuted. Yeah. So we have a huge history of welcoming those individuals who are being persecuted, and here in Ukraine, people losing their lives. So we need to support them.
OK, we're just a couple of minutes away from Prime Minister's questions. We can have a look at the House of Commons, which I think is filling up. MPs in the chamber waiting to hear from the Prime Minister. And, of course, that will be overseen by the Speaker of the House of Commons. And on that note, it's probably just worth mentioning something that came out yesterday. This was John Bercow, the former Speaker of the House of Commons. An independent inquiry said that he had been found to be a serial bully. Now, that was something that John Bercow disputed, but we can have a look at this headline from BBC News. Ex-Commons Speaker John Bercow was a serial bully, says report. This was an independent panel which upheld the findings of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner Catherine Stone. Pippa, I think Labour have suspended John Bercow, we understand, pending an inquiry, but it does seem there's already been one.
Oh, there's an 89-page inquiry there, isn't there? And the facts are pretty damning. There's 21 allegations against him, all of which were upheld. As you say, the ex-speaker has contested some of the findings, but all you need to do is sit and read through the report to see how widespread over how many years they were. And these allegations, of course, are not new. These are ones that have been around for some time, also came to a head a few years ago. And, you know, I think Labour obviously will have its internal processes it needs to go through, its due processes, but you can't imagine it coming to any conclusion really other than that which is presented by this report, and concluding that somebody who has exhibited this sort of behaviour shouldn't have a home in the Labour Party.
Mark?
Yes, and even before the allegations about John Bercow himself were eventually concluded and proven, the report says he was a serial bully and that he's a liar in terms of how he responded to the investigation, which is quite, really, I've rarely seen such a brutal set of conclusions. In 2018, there was a judge-led inquiry into the issue of bullying of parliamentary employees, not MPs' employees, which is a wider issue, and that judge concluded that for there to be a start in fixing the institution's cultural problem, the Speaker ought to go. And then there were these allegations against him. And throughout that, I'm afraid quite a lot of people turned a blind eye because they kind of liked him or they found him politically useful. I have to be a little careful because I've done reporting on bullying, talking to MPs' staff in different parties who've experienced some really unpleasant treatment from MPs. On a confidential basis. This is a wider and serious issue which I think we're yet to see the full extent of, and I wonder how people who'd suffered that bullying felt when they saw people stand up in the House of Commons and applaud John Bercow as a magnificent person, when an awful lot of people knew that this was a problem.
Emma, briefly, did people turn a blind eye?
I don't know, and I can't get drawn into commenting on individual circumstances and individual people. What I will say, though, is I agree with the point around the climate. I agree with that issue altogether. It's why I think the Labour Party have called for an independent...
Emma, I'm sorry to interject. We've got the Prime Minister on his feet for Prime Minister's questions.
To an address like the one given yesterday by President Zelenskyy. And so I want to tell the House that working with our friends and allies across the free world, we will